Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is December 16th, and we are in the middle of Chanukah. Not only are we in the middle of Chanukah, today is also Rosh Chodesh Teves. This week's going to be Parshas Mikeitz, but I want to talk about Chanukah because we're in the middle of Chanukah, and you can never, during the midst of Chanukah, you can never talk about Chanukah too much. But this also will relate to something that came up last week. In last week's class, Shira Liss raised a point, and I was not familiar with it. But since last week, I've done a little bit of homework, and I got to say that she mentioned something last week that I had not been familiar with, but I've found some fascinating information out about. Let's jump right in. In Parshas Vayishlach, which was 2 weeks ago, right? Last week was Vayeshev, and the week before that was Vayishlach. In Parshas Vayishlach, we saw something, and I never made a connection between Parshas Vayishlach and Chanukah before, because Vayishlach and Chanukah never coincide. Vayeshev and Mikeitz will coincide with Chanukah, but never Vayishlach, so I never thought that there was a connection. She suggested there might be a connection. I said, I've never seen something on that, but this week I did, and I want to share it with you. In Parshas Vayishlach, Perek Lamed Beis, right before Yaakov finally has this encounter with Esav that he's been planning for, and in a sense he's been dreading for so long. So the final detail that takes place before that encounter is as follows. It says that Yaakov Avinu wakes up during the night, wakes up his whole family, and there we are in Perek Lamed Beis, that's chapter 32, Pasuk Chaf Daled, 24. Vayikachem vayavirem es hanachal, that he takes his entire family and he brings them across the stream. Vaya'aver es asher lo, and he brings across all of his belongings as well. The pasuk continues, Vayivaser Yaakov levado. Yaakov was then left all alone. Vayayavek ish imo, and a man wrestled with him ad alos hashachar, until the morning, until the break of dawn. Who was that man who wrestled with Esav? He may have looked like a man, but according to our commentaries, according to the Midrash, it was the Sar Shal Esav. It was Esav's guardian angel, spent that night wrestling with Yaakov. Chavav, last pasuk, Vayar ki lo yachalo, when the angel sees that he cannot succeed in beating Yaakov, he does a dirty trick. Vayaga, he touches his hip socket, and he dislocates the hip socket of Yaakov in the course of wrestling with him. That is what the pasuk tells us. Now the question is, why did Yaakov, in Pasuk Chaf Daled we read that he takes his whole family and they cross a river. And then in Chaf Hey it says, Vayivaser Yaakov levado, that Yaakov was all alone. Why was Yaakov all alone? He just crossed with his whole family. Why was he left all alone? So Rashi quotes the Medrash. Rashi says, Vayivaser Yaakov. Yaakov was left all alone. Why? Shachach pachim ketanim v'chazar aleim. He had forgotten some small containers and he returned for them. So meaning what? Pasuk Abdallah tells us he wakes the whole family up and they all cross a stream. So why would Yaakov be alone? It seems like he went back to where they had come from. He crossed the stream again and went back because he had forgotten some small containers, some pachim ketanim. That's what we were told. Why did Yaakov go back for these small containers? So some of the commentaries on Rashi and on the Medrash say Yaakov was such an ish emes, an honest man, that all of his belongings that he had were earned honestly. There was no gezel, there was no thievery involved, and therefore he felt such value to even his smallest items, these inconsequential items, these small containers. He loved them because of the fact they were earned honestly, and that's why they have great value in his eyes. He went back to get them. That's what many of the commentaries say to explain that Rashi. That's quoting the Medrash. Okay. Now, last week, Shira Liss brought up a point, is that she said there could be a connection. And I, again, had said, I never heard of this, but let's see what the connection is. The Rambam writes in his Mishnah Torah, when he's talking about the whole story of Chanukah, so we know how it begins, that the Yavanim, the Syrian Greeks, had occupied Israel, and they were oppressing Am Yisrael, the Jewish people there. They were putting severe limitations on the study, the teaching of Torah, and they had gotten involved in the Beis HaMikdash. They had overrun it with idols, and they had really made a full-fledged attempt to impose their lifestyle and their culture on Bnei Yisrael. And finally, a band of Chashmonaim, of Kohanim, say, we're not going to take this anymore, and they go to war against the Yevanim. It looks like an impossible struggle, but somehow or another, Hashem makes a miracle that somehow or another, this small band of Chashmonaim beats this incredibly mighty army of the Yevanim. And now let's see in the Rambam what happens when they return to the Beis HaMikdash to reclaim the Beis HaMikdash. Rambam writes, when the Jewish people, the Jewish forces were victorious against their enemies and they destroyed them when they beat them on the battlefield, it was on the 25th day of Kislev. They went into the Beis HaMikdash, and they could not find pure oil. Ella pach echad. All they found was one small jar, one small container. There only should have been enough oil in that jar to light for one day. But miraculously, they used that jar to fill up all the lamps in the menorah, and they all stayed lit, illuminated for 8 complete days. Why the number 8? Ad shekashu zesim. That was enough time that was necessary to crush olives and to produce new olive oil, votzi shemen tar, to make new purified olive oil. So that's what the Rambam tells us, and that's why we celebrate for 8 days. We light our menorah for 8 days. We'll get to this soon, but that's why we light our menorah for 8 days, to commemorate this miracle, that what should have been only enough oil to last for 1 day, lasted for 8. To commemorate that, that's where Chanukah is 8 days. So Shira said, look at that. That when the Rambam, and he's quoting the Gemara in Shabbos, when it talks about this miracle, it says they found pach echad, they found one small container. And what did Yaakov go back for? Rashi said Yaakov went back, shachach pachim ketanim. He went back for small containers. It looks like there's a connection. And I told Shira, I said, I never heard of such a thing. I never saw such a connection. It's just the same word, pach. Never, whatever. It's the same word. It happens to be used in 2 different contexts, but there's no connection. That's what I told her last week. But I did some research since then, and I found an amazing connection between those two. I don't think this ever caught my attention before. Shachach pachim ketanim, that Yaakov went back for small containers. And again, the story of Chanukah, what was it that Klal Yisrael found when they went back into the Beis HaMikdash was pach echad, a container, one small container. So again, there you see that word pach is being used. Fascinating. I want to share with you a source that delves into this. Here's a brief bio. I never knew, I had his commentary at home, but I never knew who the author was. The author was Rabbi Yisachar Ber Eilenberg, who was a Polish rabbi born in Posen around 1570. He died in Austerlitz in Moravia in 1623. I Googled Austerlitz just to try to see where it was and what it might be famous for. And I was amazed to see something that I just don't know this part of world history about the Napoleonic Wars. But apparently one of the greatest victories that Napoleon experienced was at the Battle of Austerlitz. Again, that's going to be a couple hundred years later, but nonetheless, that's where, if you Google it, that's the first thing that'll jump out at you, Austerlitz, is that was the site of this incredible victory of Napoleon against, I think, 3 different armies. And I guess at some point there was a Jewish community there, and that's where this Rabbi Yisachar Ber Eilenberg had served as a rabbi for a good chunk of years. He studied in the yeshiva of Rabbi Mordechai Yafi. He was known as the Lavush. He was a contemporary of the Ramah. Okay, so Rabbi Eilenberg authored several Sfarim. One of them was called Seder Laderech, which was a super commentary on Rashi. We know Rashi is seen as the primary commentary to Chumash. Well, Rashi did such a great job that numerous other rabbis over the years said, we have to write a commentary, to Rashi, because every word of Rashi is so precious. We have to analyze it and go through it and make sure that we understand everything that Rashi said. So one of the people who wrote a commentary on Rashi was this Rabbi Yisachar Ber Eilenberg, and it's called Seder Laderech. So we're going to look at the Seder Laderech on this Rashi. Rashi says, again, by Vaser Yaakov, that Yaakov was left alone. Why was he left alone? Shachach pachim ketanim. He forgot small jars. V'chazar aleihem. He went back for them. So let's look at this Seder Laderech together. I'm on page 2. Tzedel HaDerech says as follows. He quotes the Rashi. Rashi, Divrei Yaakov. Yaakov was left all alone. Why was he alone? Shachach pachim ketanim. He forgot small jars or containers. The chazar alayhem. So he went back to get them. Kasav Rav Gadol Rashal. So the Marshal, Shlomo Luria, was one of the leading sages prior to, in the generation, in the years before Rabbi Eilenberg, one of the leading lights of Polish Jewry. So the Marshal writes, he wants to explain, where did Rashi get this from? Or the Medrash, rather, that Rashi's quoting, where did it get it from? That Yaakov forgot small containers? Where did this come from? So he says, Shachach pachim ketanim, Lefi, where do I know this? Lefi shenemar, because the pasuk said in Chav Daled, right above, Vayaveres kol asher lo, that Vayaveres kol asher lo, that he brought across the river everything that he had, all of his possessions. Imkain, if he got everything, why was Yaakov left all alone? Ella, what must it be? Right, he had brought across all of his important possessions. But then he realized that some of his inconsequential, some of his unimportant stuff was left behind, and that's why he went back for it. Okay, that's his first thing he says. Now let's look where the finger's pointing, inami. Another way how you can explain why Rashi, or rather the Medrash that Rashi is quoting, how did he know that Yaakov had gone back for small containers? Inami, or you can say as follows. L'kacham ar pachim ketanim. This is why the Medrash says that Yaakov went back for small containers. Lefisha matzinu, he says there is a tradition we have. He's quoting a Medrash, but he doesn't tell you where it is. Lefisha matzinu, we know that there's this Medrash that's out there. Shakadosh Baruch Hu amar lo Yaakov. God said to Yaakov, Ata masarta nafshecha, you risked your life, al pach katan, to get a small jar bishvili, that was for my sake. Gamani ba'atzmi, so what will I do, says God? Ashalem levanecha, I will repay your offspring, v'pach katan, with a small container. When will that happen? Livnei chashmonai, to the descendants of the Chashmonaim, in the Chanukah story. Shenasa nes, a great miracle will occur, al yedei pach katan. And a great miracle will occur through a small pach, through a small container, a small jug, a jar. So he's quoting, this Tzedel HaDerech is quoting an amazing Medrash, that God says to Yaakov, you risked your life in order to get a pach katan in my sake, so I'm going to pay you back measure for measure, that your children, your offspring, years from now, they will, after risking their lives, after they were Moser Nefesh, I'm going to reward them with a pach katan, with a small jar, that a great nace, a great miracle will happen through it, and that's the Chanukah story. But where do we find anywhere in the Torah that Yaakov risked his life for a small jar for God's sake? Ela vadai, what must you say? Hacha, it's here. The pasuk says that Yaakov woke up during the night and he crossed over the river with his whole family and everything that they owned, all their important belongings. So then why was Yaakov left all alone in the next pasuk? He went back to get a small container, but what was in that small container? It was a small container of shemen, of oil. He wanted to use that oil to anoint in some kind of avoda, some kind of act of service, a divine service. He wanted to anoint, he was going to set up a matzeva. He had pledged to God that upon returning to Israel, he was going to set up a monument where he was going to daven in Beis El. And if he set up that monument, the pasuk tells us he poured oil over it. That's it. He did a nisuch. He did a libation on top of it with oil. So how does this medrash make sense? Where do we find that Yaakov risked his life for oil, for a container? He risked his life for a container when Vayivasar Yaakov Levado, that he went back and was left all alone. And he says, why? To get that pach katan, a small container. But how do you explain that medrash? You risked your life for my sake. What does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with Hashem? So the Tzedel HaDerech is saying it must be that small container contained oil. And Yaakov was going to use that little container of oil to pour over that matzeva, over that monument that he was going to erect in Beis El. Now it's a beautiful Midah Keneged Midah. Now you see how it all works measure for measure. God says to Yaakov, you risked your life to get a small container of oil for my sake. So after your children risked their life for my sake to reclaim the Jewish sovereignty in Israel and the Beis HaMikdash, I'm going to reward them with a small container of oil with a massive nace. A great miracle will occur, and that's the miracle of Chanukah. Beautiful. He says, "V'lama vayvasar Yaakov levado levadei pakatan shel shemen." He was going back for a small container of oil that he wanted to use to anoint the matzeva in Beitel, and that's where he would set it up. That's what he forgot. That's what he went back for. And again, that container of oil, since he had pledged that he was going to use that for divine service, it technically wasn't his. So the pasuk makes sense that he brought across the stream all of his belongings. What did he not bring across the stream? Something which was no longer his, that he had pledged to God. Something which belonged to Hashem, Lenasach, that he was going to use for libations. That's what he went back for. So he says, now we've got a beautiful medrash that makes sense of this. And then you might say this makes more sense than what the commentaries say about Rashi. Rashi says that he went back for small containers. So did you ever stop and wonder, why would Yaakov risk his life to go back and get these small, inexpensive containers? Was he cheap? So some commentaries say, no, he went back to get them because he really valued, this is what we quoted at the beginning, he really valued all of his belongings, even the inexpensive ones, since they came to him through honesty. That's what I always learned. The Tzedel HaDerech is saying, no, there's another way to learn this. You know why he went back for those Pachim Ketanim? Because that small container was something he had pledged to God. It contained oil that he said was going to be used for divine service. He was going to use that as libations on the Matzeva, the monument he was going to set up in Beisal. That's why he went back, because he needed it for that avoda. So it really, in a sense, makes that Rashi make more sense. But he says, and now is a beautiful medrash. Yaakov went back for that. So Hashem says, I'm going to pay you measure for measure. You risked your life, putting yourself out there to get that small jar of oil for my sake. Now I'm going to repay you. That your descendants, after risking their lives to reclaim Jewish sovereignty and the Beis HaMikdash, I will give them a small jar of oil with which a great miracle will occur, and that's the miracle of Chanukah. What a beautiful medrash. But this also makes a connection to something I had not known before this year. That Pachim Ketanim, that Rashi that says Yaakov went back for Pachim Ketanim. It's no accident that of all the words the medrash could have used, he used Pachim, Pach. Why? Because the miracle of Chanukah was with a Pach Echad, with one Pach, one small container of oil. Of all the words, why they use Pach? There's that connection. Pach here, Pach there. What a beautiful medrash. I want to just share with you, look at the intellectual honesty of the Tzedel HaDerech. I showed this to my students at school. Look at this last line. He ends by saying, after I just did such a great job tying this all together, there's one thing that I'm not 100% satisfied with. V'adayin, where I've got the cursor, v'adayin eno miyushav, it's still not sitting 100% well with me, because there's one part of this that's not 100% glatt that I don't fully have. Minole Rashi, d'shnei pachim hayu. Why did Rashi say plural? Look back at Rashi. Rashi said, Vayivasar Yaakov, shachach pachim ketanim. He found pachim. Pachim is plural. He went back to get small jars or small containers. And that's what he went back. Why did he say plural? According to this medrash that Tzedel HaDerech says, I'm trying to use to make this all make sense, all he should have gone back for was one jar. Because again, the medrash says that you risked your life. You were moser nefesh. Let's look at his words again. The medrash says, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Amar Yaakov, Ata masarta nafshecha al pach katan, one small jar b'shvili, one small jar for my sake. So I'm going to go and I'm going to gift your children a small jar of oil after they risk their lives for my sake as well. So again, according to this, it should have been pure mita keneged mita. For one jar, you get one jar. So then why did Rashi say pachim ktanim, small containers? So that's what he says. I want to be intellectually honest. I think this is all beautiful to make this connection. There's one thing that doesn't sit 100% with me, is that why did it say Lashon Rabim? So some of my, in a plural, some of my students had some suggestions there, and I think we could all come up with some suggestions as to what you might say there. But nonetheless, I think this is a fascinating medrash that sheds light on this, and that really makes a connection in an area that I didn't know existed before. So I thank Shira for raising that point last week, and I'm so excited that the Hashgacha had it, that we found this week. That's the first item I want to share with you for Chanukah. I'm gonna go to stop share because I want to bring up another item that I want to share with you for Chanukah. I thought that's absolutely fascinating. So let me now go to share with you another item. Here it is. And here we go. All right. This sheet is something I had prepared before that, which was, why do we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 nights and not just 7? We're going to look at something that's known as the famous question of the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef was Rav Yosef Karo, and he was the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and he asks perhaps the most famous question on Hanukkah. You cannot go very far when you talk about Hanukkah Torah, all Divrei Torah for Hanukkah, without someone coming up with a creative suggestion, creative answer for the question of the Beis Yosef. So let's talk about the Beis Yosef's question for a minute. I started off here with the Rambam. I read to you on the last sheet that we just looked at, paragraph Beis, the second paragraph. And here's how the Rambam describes the Hanukkah story. In the first paragraph, he talks about how the Syrian Greeks greatly oppressed the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and for so many years, they had control of the Beis Hamikdash, which they defiled, and they made it filled with idols, and they disgraced it, they disparaged it, they made it so difficult to observe the Torah and mitzvahs in the land of Israel. These are all the atrocities and all the crimes that the Yevanim, the Syrian Greeks, committed. In paragraph Beis, the second paragraph, what do we read in the previous sheet? That when they came, the Maccabeim, when they liberated the Beis Hamikdash, all they found was one small jar of oil that only had enough to fill the menorah should have burned for 1 day, but miracle of miracles, it lasted for 8 days, which was how much time they needed in order to press olives and get new oil. So we're going to see now paragraph Gimel. Because of this, that the oil burnt for 8 days, the oil in the menorah burnt for 8 days, that's why the sages of that time, they made a decree, that these 8 days, beginning on the night of the 25th of Kislev, these are days of rejoicing and praising God. And we light lamps, candles, lights, be'erev each of those evenings, al pischei abatim, at the entrance to our houses. V'chol laila v'laila mishmonas haleilos. We do this each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah. That's what the Rambam tells us. And now we're going to talk about the question of the Beis Yosef. We mentioned it last week. Last week, I believe, we shared the Chassam Sofer, which talked about, it had a beautiful way to understand Al Anisim, why it said B'chatzros Katshecha, because why did they talk about lighting the menorah out in the Chatzar? That's in the courtyard. That's not where it belonged. And after the Chassam Sofer explained that, he says, with that, you can answer the Beis Yosef's question. So now I want to get to, where is the Beis Yosef's question? So let's see the Beis Yosef's question. He says, I've got a fundamental question on this entire concept of Hanukkah being for 8 days. So let's see the bottom of the page. It says, V'ika lamedak. There is to examine, to investigate. Lama kavu shmona yamim. Why did our sages establish 8 days of Hanukkah? The kivan deshemen shebepach, since the oil that was in the container, hayabo kidei lahadlik laila achas, there was enough oil to last 1 night. V'nimsa shelo nasa hanes ela b'shiva leila. So it comes out there was only 7 nights of miracles, not 8. Again, what's the whole Hanukkah story? That the Kohanim found 1 flask of oil, which should have burnt for 1 day. They filled the menorah with it, and it burnt for 8 days. Miracles! So we have Hanukkah for 8 days. The Beis Yosef says, 1 second. If there was enough oil in that flask for 1 day, then how many days of miracles were there? Not 8, 7. There was enough for 1 day. The real miracle is 7 days. So why is Hanukkah 8 days? We should be commemorating 7 days of miracles. That's the question of the Beis Yosef. I want to share with you today several answers, I would say early answers to the Beis Yosef's question. The Beis Yosef himself gives 3 answers to this question. Let's see these 3 answers. The Beis Yosef's first answer he gives, I've got it at the top of page 2, V'yesh lomar. So his first answer is, Shechilku shemen shebepach l'shmona chalakim. As soon as they found that 1 jar of oil, they immediately said, okay, we know it's going to take us 8 days to get new oil. So we could either burn all that oil 1 day, and then we're out for the next 7 days. There's no semblance. There's no memory of a menorah being lit. Or what we could do is let's divide up the oil into 8 sections, because we know it's going to be 8 days till we have fresh oil. So let's divide it up into 8 sections, and we'll light a little bit one of those 8 sections, each of those 8 days until we have new oil. So granted, we won't have a menorah burning the entire night, but at least we'll have something each of those nights, each of those 8 nights until we have fresh oil. So that was their original plan. V'yesh lomar, here's what the first answer. Shechilku shemen shebepach, they split up, they divided the oil that was in that flask, l'shmona halakim, to 8 sections, 8 units. And the plan was each night we're going to put in the menorah, in all of the lamps of the menorah, a bit of the oil that we divided in those 8 sections. And amazingly, what should have each night only burnt for an hour or 2, burnt the entire night until the morning. The nimsa, so it comes out, so it comes out each night there was a miracle, even night number 1. Why? Look what the Beis Yosef did. What was his question? Night number 1 didn't look miraculous. Night number 1, it should have stayed lit. There was enough oil to stay lit. The miracle is the next 7 nights. So now the Beis Yosef says, no. You misunderstood. They didn't put all the oil into the menorah at once. If they did that, you're right. There would have only been 7 days of miracles. They divided it up into 8 units, and they put 1 unit each night. And miraculously, each unit, which only should have lasted an hour or 2, lasted for the entire night. So that comes out even on the first night there was a nace. So that's why there's 8 nights of miracles. Therefore, we have 8 nights of Chanukah. That's the Beis Yosef's first answer. Let's see his second and third answers. That's what I got next. The second answer, he says, another answer we can suggest. Really, they filled it up in its entirety. They used all the oil that was in the pach, that was in that flask. They filled up the menorah totally. However, miracle of miracles was they now look at the flask after using the flask to totally fill up the menorah. Nishar hapach malei kibatchila. The flask was just as filled as it was when they started. In other words, this makes no sense. You just used the flask, which should totally be empty after filling up the menorah. They filled up the menorah and they look at the flask, it's still full. It's still filled to the lid. That's a miracle right there. V'nikar hanes. Therefore, the miracle was recognizable af b'layla rishon, even on the first night. So this is a very different answer. According to this answer to Beis Yosef, they did fill up the entire menorah, and they should have been using up that flask even on day 1. But then miracle of miracles was even though they filled up the menorah, the flask wasn't diminished. So there was a miracle that occurred even on the first day. The flask wasn't diminished, and that's why there were 8 days of miracles. That's his answer number 2. What's his answer number 3? Inami, another answer. Shibalel Rishon, on the first night of Chanukah, on that 25th of Kislev. Nosnu kol Hashem b'neros. They put in all the oil into each one of the lamps. V'dolku kol alayla, and it burnt the entire night. Ubaboker, but what did they see in the morning? Matsu haneros maleim shemen. Each one of the lamps was still full. Meaning, in his third answer, he's saying they took that jar, and yes, they totally filled up, the flask rather, and they totally filled up all the lamps of the menorah. And when they looked at that jar, it was empty. They totally emptied it out. But what was the miracle? That the level of oil in each lamp of the menorah never went down, even on night number 1. So there was a miracle even on the first night, because again, had it gone according to the laws of nature, it should have all gone down the first night too. But the miracle was even on the first night, the level never dropped and never went down. So there was a miracle on the first night as well. So the Beis Yosef himself was the one who asked this question, posed the question, and he himself suggested 3 answers to this question. He left it there. In the years since, hundreds of answers have been proposed. But this is the famous question of Beis Yosef and the 3 answers that he proposed. I want to share with you 2 additional ones here. So one is from the Pri Chadash. I've got it there under A. The Pri Chadash, that was an early commentary to the Shulchan Aruch. The Pri Chadash asserts that the first day of Chanukah would have been instituted even had the miracle of oil not occurred. He argues the first day of Chanukah celebrates the miraculous military defeat of the Syrian Greeks. This is similar to the one day of Purim on which we celebrate our salvation from the decree of Haman. The Pri Chadash explains the other 7 days were added due to the extra 7 miraculous days of the oil burning. So what the Pri Chadash's answer to the Beis Yosef's question is, again, what was the Beis Yosef's question? Is that if they found enough oil for 1 day and it lasted for 7, there's only 7, it lasted for 8, there's only 7 days of miracle. not 8, because there was enough oil for the first day. So the Pri Chadash is saying, you're right. Day number 1, what we're celebrating was not the miracle of the oil, because you're right, there was no miracle in that oil burning for day number 1. Day number 1, we're celebrating the miracle of the military victory. There shouldn't have been a military victory. That this guerrilla band, this band of Kohanim, these warriors, they should go up against the mightiest military force in the region, the Yevanim, the Syrian Greek army, and they should have won? That's amazing. That's a miracle. And just like on Purim, we have a one-day celebration for the miracle against Haman and the battle that ensued, where Bnei Yisrael went to war against their enemies on a preemptive strike and were successful. That's what's going on Chanukah. Day 1 is celebrating the military victory. That was clearly a miracle. And days 2 through 8, the next 7 days, that's celebrating the miracle of the oil. But there never was a miracle for the first day of the oil, because that makes sense. That's the way the Pri Chadash answers this. A very similar answer is from the Meiri, which was prior to the Pri Chadash. He says as follows, B, I've got that there. The Meiri presented this approach centuries before Pri Chadash. He adds another answer, that the first day of Chanukah is dedicated to celebrating not only the military miracle, but also the miracle that we discovered even 1 flask of oil the Syrian Greeks did not render tameh, that they didn't defile. So meaning what the Meiri wants to suggest to answer the Beis Yosef's question is that, yeah, there were 8 miracles. What do you mean? Only 7 days is miraculous. With that flask of oil, there was enough oil for 1 day. But the Meiri says, but it was a miracle we even had 1 flask. Why should there have been of 1 flask? The Yevanim, the Syrian Greeks, they were on an all-out campaign to defile the Beis HaMikdash. They did everything they could to defile it. How did they miss that 1 flask? They got everything else, and they missed that 1 flask. The fact that there was that 1 surviving flask of pure oil, that was a miracle. So that's number 1. And then the next 7 days of the miraculous burning, that's days 2 through 8 of Chanukah. But that's how you have 8 days of miracles, according to the Meiri. So we've seen right now 5 answers, 3 from the Beis Yosef, 1 from the Pri Chadash, and 1 from the Meiri, that are all out to say that, yeah, 8 days are all miraculous. It's just different ways to figure it out. The question of Beis Yosef was, day number 1 doesn't seem miraculous. And the answer, these 5 answers, were different ways of saying that, yeah, there was a miracle in day 1, 5 different ways to explain how there was a miracle in day 1. I want to share with you the Aruch HaShulchan. Here's 2 answers from the Aruch HaShulchan. The second answer, I'm not going to share with you this morning, because I shared that last Friday. And the video Divrei Torah I put out before Shabbos, I went through the Aruch HaShulchan's second answer. And if you want, that's there on our YouTube channel. You can find that there. That's a fascinating answer. But I wanted to share with you the first answer of the Aruch HaShulchan today. Look at the first one. He writes as follows. Why? He wants to know, why is it 8 days? So all the answers we've seen till now have said, found ways, 5 different ways to say, yeah, there really was a miracle on day 1. And then dates 2 through 8 were the miracle of the oil. The Aruch HaShulchan in his first answer, he's quoting a much earlier source, the Shiltei Giborim. He says something else. He says, V'yesh shekasav, there are those who say, you know why Chanukah is celebrated for 8 days? You're right, this miracle of the menorah took place, but that's not why they set up Chanukah for 8 days. That's a totally independent reason. You know why we have Chanukah for 8 days? V'yesh shekasav, there are those who write, Lefi shebitlu mehem mitzvas milah, is that one of the things that the Yevanim, one of the mitzvahs that the Yevanim put such an emphasis in to try to stop and put an end to was the mitzvah of circumcision. That we take our boys at 8 days old, if assuming they're healthy, and we give them a circumcision. And that's how we enter them into the covenant, the Brisa Shel Avram, the covenant of Avram. Shila Shmona Yamin, that's supposed to be at 8 days. And for as long as the Syrian Greeks, the Yevanim were in control, they did their best to abolish that mitzvah of Milah. With the victory of the Chashmonaim, we were able to reclaim the mitzvah of Milah. The mitzvah of Milah occurs on the child's 8th day, again, assuming he's healthy and the doctors give the green light. So therefore, that we should never forget what was so special to us and what we really felt. One of the major reasons we felt the effects of this victory and the celebratory nature of this victory was because now we were able to be Makayim, we were able to fulfill the mitzvah of Milah as it was intended to. In order to remember that, we said we're going to celebrate for 8 days. So yes, there were 7 miraculous days of Chanukah, but that's not why Chanukah, of the oil burning on Chanukah. And that's right, it's only 7. But that's not why Hanukkah was set up for 8 days. Hanukkah was set up for 8 days because of the reinstitution of Milah, being able to be observed the way it was supposed to be observed. To remind us of that, that's why Hanukkah was set up for 8 days, to remind us that on the 8th day, we're able to give bris milah again. That's the real reason why Hanukkah is 8 days. Yes, the menorah miraculously burnt, the oil that we've found in that Pach Shemen miraculously burnt for 8 days, but that's not why Hanukkah is 8 days, because you're right, the Beis Yosef's question is too good. That was only 7 days of miracles. So that's his first answer. We have a little time. I'll tell you outside his second answer. The second answer that the Aruch HaShulchan says, and this is what I said over on Friday, is the second answer Aruch HaShulchan says is that he brings down from the book of the Maccabees, Sefer Hashmonai, that the year leading up to Chanukah, Bnei Yisrael missed out on Sukkot. They couldn't celebrate Sukkot properly because the Yavanim, the Syrian Greeks who ruled the Beis Hamikdash, they couldn't perform the Avoda, all the special temple service. They couldn't do that, what needed to be done on Sukkot. In the land of Israel, how many days is Sukkot? 7 days. But then you have Shmini Atzeres, which is the 8th day. And on Shmini Atzeres, there's a whole special avoda, special service that takes place in the Beis Hamikdash as well. But Bnei Yisrael couldn't fulfill that because the Syrian Greeks were still in charge. So they missed out on Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. That's 8 days of service, of celebration in the Beis Hamikdash. And that's traumatic for Bnei Yisrael as a people. For generations after generation after generation, they were able to celebrate Sukkot as it was intended, with Shmini Atzeres as it was intended to be celebrated in the Beis Hamikdash. And now they lost it. So they said when we finally have the Beis Hamikdash back, we have to compensate. We have to find some way to give ourselves a shot in the arm to get that sense of Ruchnius back, because we missed out. So they were going to set up an 8-day Yom Tov. Nothing to do with the miracle of the oil. The reason why they were going to set up an 8-day Yom Tov was to compensate for the fact that we missed out on 8 days of celebration, appropriate celebration in the Beis Hamikdash, because we missed Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. Once they saw that the oil stayed burning for 8 days, they took that as a siman min hashamayim. They took that as a heavenly sign that God was saying to them, Yasher Koach. We think God says this is a good idea, to have an 8-day celebration in the month of Kislev. Remembering this, how did God give us that handshake and say Yasher Koach? By this miracle that the oil stayed burning for 8 days. That says to us the decision we made to celebrate a new holiday rather, for 8 days. That's the correct decision. So that was Hashem was doing, saying, I'm maskim, I agree with that. The reason we're celebrating for 8 days is not because the miraculous burning of the oil lasted for 8 days, because then you have the Beis Yosef's kasha, his question, that there was only 7 days of miracles. So what the Aruch HaShulchan is saying is that, no, we celebrate for 8 days because that's what the original decree was, to compensate for the lost Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. Why do we light menorah for 8 days during that time? Because the miracle of the menorah occurred, and we took that for a siman, as a heavenly sign that God says, I like the idea that you have to have established a new holiday, an 8-day holiday now, to compensate for Sukkot and for Shavuos. That's what he says there. I commented on Friday that what that just has me thinking, made me think, and it still has me thinking, is that what do you see from this? Is that the Aruch HaShulchan is saying that the way Bnei Yisrael reacted when they saw we missed out on a Yom Tov, now that we have that ability to fully celebrate it, we have to find some way to compensate. And I can't help but think that. In other words, during this time of the pandemic, thank God we were able to observe our holidays the best that we can. We don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we can't celebrate them in a Beis Hamikdash, but we were all able to celebrate Pesach in our homes. We were all able to celebrate Shavuos in our homes. But during that period of time, we weren't able to gather and daven. We didn't have tefillah b'tzibor. We didn't have regular Torah laning. And for many members of our community still now, for one reason or another, they don't feel safe coming out, and or their doctors don't want them to come out and to rejoin in tefillah b'tzibor. God willing, we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The vaccines are on the corner. Hopefully we'll be able to get past this pandemic soon, and this will be a thing of the past. And when we're able to fully engage once again in our full Jewish communal life, the question is, what will we do to compensate? What will we do to mark and say, what to make up for what was missed out upon? That tefillah b'tzibor, will we find some way to, increase our decorum in shul, to make tefillah, to make davening as a minyan, to make that a more meaningful experience, to find some way to cut down on the talking. I don't know. I'm still trying to think about it. And even though, as I said, we've been able to celebrate Yom Tov and Shabbos, we haven't been able to do so with guests. What are we going to do when we're able to finally invite guests once again? What will we do to compensate? Will we find some way to elevate the level of discussion at the table, that we're not going to say improper things about people, members of the community, members of whoever it may be. We'll try to talk more Torah at the table. We'll try to make it a more meaningful. I don't know. I'm trying to think about it. And I think it's a challenge for each and every one of us to think about as well. That God willing, we'll get out of these trying and challenging times very soon. But when we do, what are we going to do to compensate for those aspects of Jewish communal life that we missed out on during this pandemic? What will we do to raise the bar and to make the opportunities we've been given more meaningful? I think it behooves us to ask these questions, to ask ourselves on a personal level what we'll do, but also on a communal level. And God willing, we'll get there soon. So I'm gonna hit the stop share. I'm going to stop